This is a homage beat.
Again, like you said, we're not judging ourselves against a set standard. We looking at, okay, I'm better than the murderer, I'm better than the rapist, I'm better than the person who abuses children, and this, that, and the third. So in comparison to them, absolutely you're better than them. But I said that's not the standard. I said therefore there must be a universal standard that is not biased. This standard must be what? Absolutely perfect. If this standard is not perfect, then clearly there's another standard above it. And I give the example of our own American society. Say many complain about the unjust laws in our society. There was a time in America where minorities were legally discriminated against. Clearly this law is not perfect and points to a higher law above the government. Right and wrong cannot be one's own personal preference, but an absolute perfect standard. And that was something that I definitely wanted to hit on, especially us as minorities, where it's like we look at this American judicial system, which is man-made and created, and you can clearly see it's flawed in so many ways. And it's like, if you take God out of the equation, who holds these governments accountable? And it's like we look at America, but there's other countries out there, countries out there like North Korea, where they've got a dictator. Who's going to ultimately hold him accountable? Who's going to hold, and I'll just stick here in America, who's going to hold the unjust things that have happened throughout America's history? Who's going to hold them accountable?
Yeah.
You know, and it's like, if you deny God, then ultimately there's not going to be any consequence.
Yeah, I mean, I agree, man. I mean, I would say that you put that there was a time in America where people were legally discriminated against, but I think it's still continuing, and it's happening now. That's a conversation for. I know that's a conversation can go different ways, but
no, but I think that's a good point. Where it's like, who's gonna hold them accountable then?
Yeah, because I mean, people are doing what is right in their own eyes, because it's just a back and forth thing here in America. Like we're just going back and forth, like every 4 years, every 8 years, like we go back to, well, I think this is right. I think this is right. I'm more progressive. I'm more conservative. I'm doing what's better for America. Well, I'm trying to do what's better for everybody. And everybody's going by their own standard, what's good and what they see. And it relates to what you're saying. Like that standard has to be perfect.
Yeah. It has to be a standard above man and government.
Yeah.
What is that standard?
Yeah, that perfect word is heavy, man. Like I want keep on expounding on that, man.
Yeah,
that
absolutely,
perfect word,
absolutely. I say man can easily find someone he is more righteous than. However, the true test of righteousness is in comparison to a perfect standard. This is the true measure of a person's morality. Again, most people deny absolute standard of right and wrong, yet whatever standard one judges by, they openly admit to not being perfect. Those who admit this are generally those who don't even hold to any biblical standard of right and wrong. By one's own standard, one typically admits they are flawed. This is extremely interesting because most who have no religious affiliation generally accept that they're not perfect. And that's kind of like the theme, if there was a spiritual truth that I was trying to draw, this idea of perfection, where it's like we've become so used to just, satisfactory work where we deem that as good. And I don't know if this is a good example, but it's like when you're in school, like the standard is 100, but if you get like a 95, you're like, man, that's good. You know, that's not perfect. That's not the standard.
Right.
The standard is what? Perfection. But we're so comfortable with not reaching that mark where we'll say, oh, that's good. And I understand in the context of school that's good, but I'm talking about everyday life where in comparison to human beings, where exactly good is perfect. Good isn't just getting by. Like we're so comfortable with just getting by when it's like, no, the standard is perfect. So even though you may be better than a murderer or a rapist or you're not going to be judged according to that standard. You're going to be judged according to a standard of perfection. And I say this because I found it extremely ironic where if you take God out of the equation, and that's what I was saying earlier with that quote, if God does not exist, what is your standard of right and wrong? Your standard of right and wrong is what I choose. And again, I know I've referenced the Breakfast Club and Charlemagne a lot, but I listened to him and his podcast and just wanting to share my worldview because he says his worldview is what? Live your truth. Essentially, truth, right and wrong are subjective to the individual, but we don't realize how damning that statement is because what's right to those who are conservative or those who are Democrat. It's two different things. So who's right and who's wrong? Because we were just talking about political landscape, and it's like who ultimately determines what's right and what's wrong. It's just majority.
Yeah.
You know, that doesn't always determine right and what's wrong. And so it's like, where do we go from here? Because it's like, if I'm my own standard of righteousness, my own standard of truth, how come I can say I do wrong? If I do wrong, I can just say I'm right because I'm my own standard of truth. And so, like I said, hopefully I'm making the question clear. I say, do you find it ironic that those who do not believe in God admit to not being perfect? Because if I don't believe in God, I can say what's right and what's wrong. Then I'm my own standard of perfection, not someone above me.
I personally don't find it ironic because I think that people, whether you're a believer or not, can understand that when perfection is a specific standard, like, and when someone's expecting you to be perfect, like, that's stressful, man.
Yeah.
I mean, you can't mess up. Like, I mean, there's no blemish. Like, you coming correct every time, and that's hard to live up to. Just about in anything you do. Even I'm we're sports guys, so I think about sports like a perfect record means you don't lose. That means like every time you're going out, you're expected to win. If you don't get it done, like you're a failure.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? So like when you're like, so I think that people can really get that concept that like, okay, I'm not perfect, because it also gives you, when you say like, even if you're not a believer and you're able to accept that, understanding that you can't be perfect, it allows you some justification for your wrong. Like if you're not perfect or you make a mistake, well, I'm not perfect.
Yeah.
Or I did this to my wife, I'm not perfect, but it's not going against, you're using your own standards still at the same time versus what the biblical standard of what is a husband, what is a father, how do you become that? So, yeah.
And so, hopefully I can explain this and articulate, because I see where you're coming from. I think how I'm trying to phrase it is for those people who deny like a universal standard of right and wrong, deny God, it violates their own worldview because they would admit that they're not perfect.
Yeah.
But perfection is exclusively a divine attribute. No human can say that they're perfect. Only God can say that he's perfect. But yet we acknowledge that a perfect standard exists. And that perfect standard is not man. Yeah. So who is that perfect standard? It's God. So even those who like, I don't believe in God and this, that, and the third, they acknowledge a standard of perfection. Yeah. But that is an attribute that can only be ascribed to God. So you're violating your own worldview by, because if you're going to be consistent with your worldview, you can say I do everything right because you're just judging yourself against you.
So would you go as far to say like any mentioning of the word perfection, like as a human being, it shouldn't even, unless you're referring to like God, should you not even refer to it? Is it a word? Is it a word that should be stated that you should just keep over here and is that just the thought of? I'm just
no. I think that's why I want to make sure I'm clarifying myself, because what I'm saying is that again, people say, if God is real, he would reveal himself, and the whole point of the book is to prove that God is real, that he's not hiding from you. And the concept of perfection kind of proves that, where no matter where you go, whether it's school, whether it's sports, where if I go 9 for 10, I understand that's not perfect. So I understand that there's a standard even above me, that I must adhere to. And so for someone to say, I don't, again, going back to live your truth, essentially truth is subjective to me, that if I'm my own standard of righteousness, then I can basically deem, like we were just talking about earlier, sex outside of marriage, I can just rationalize in my head that that's right. Or people who lie, I can it's just a white lie. I didn't hurt anybody. Yeah. What? It's a victimless crime, right? So I can rationalize the things that I do wrong if I'm my own standard of perfection, if I'm my own standard of righteousness. Anything that I do wrong, I can justify and say that it's right. Yeah. You know what I mean? So that's what I'm saying, that it goes inconsistent with someone who does not believe in God. Now, you can use the word perfection, but realizing it's a violation of your own. Because, and I don't know if this is a go, and I listened to this guy named Todd Friel as Wretched Radio, when people would, and we'll kind of get into that too, where it's like, if for someone to argue that you're wrong, they have to come from a standard of and okay, here's a better example. When people look at the Bible and say, that's wrong, that's foul, that don't believe anything that's in there. So for you to say that, that means that you have the standard of what is right.
That's right.
And so, okay, I'll accept your premise that the Bible is wrong. How are you judging the Bible is wrong? Like, point me to the truth. Because if the Bible is wrong, I want to know what the truth is. Most people can't do that.
Yeah.
Because they're just judging the Bible based off their own preference and opinion.
Yeah.
So it's like, okay, I accept your premise, the Bible is wrong. So that would imply that you have the truth.
Mm-hmm.
I want to follow you.
That's good.
You know, and so that's what I was saying. And so if we get back to Matthew, I say people may acknowledge that they do good works. However, the verse in Matthew says a healthy tree cannot bear bad fruit, nor can a diseased tree bear good fruit. So in acknowledging that one is not perfect, one also acknowledges they bear bad fruit. However, it is universally agreed that a healthy tree cannot bear bad fruit. In the analogy of the trees, we are the trees and our actions are the fruit. Therefore, we may do what good things.
Yeah.
If we also do bad things, are we truly good people? And that was like just thinking about that concept where it's like, so we were saying someone says they're a good person, then they point to all the good things that they do, but then they disregard all the bad things that they do, and it's like, so wait, so how can you truly be good if you actually do bad things? And I say, in the analogy of the tree, common sense says if a tree bears bad fruit, the tree is bad. Therefore, if people do wrong, how can they contend that they're good people? For example, if there are 2 glasses of water, one is completely mixed with the fatal poison while the other is only mixed with the drop. Are not both glasses poisonous? In comparison to a hardened criminal, we may look like saints. However, we lie, we steal, and we're disrespectful. Therefore, can we truly say we're good people? Ironically, when someone addresses another about their sin, one typically responds in addressing the sin of someone else. And I kind of already answered it, but I say, when someone does bring to your attention that you do wrong, how do we generally respond back to that individual who's like calling us out?
Goes back to marriage and life. Your wife calls you, oh, you're lying. Nah, you're lying. You remember that time you just lied the other day? Like, you remember when you just said that?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, you left, like, why didn't you do this to the dishes? You don't wash the dishes either. Like, so you just coming up. Like, well, what about when you didn't do this? Like, so you just always coming back.
Yeah,
Whenever somebody comes at you like that, you're generally like,
defensive.
You're defensive. Like, you're like, whoa, let me protect myself because I think that I'm right now. So.
Yeah. And I try to give the caricature. I say this scenario is seen all the time in the caricature of the self-righteous nut and the depraved atheist. The religious person is calling out the atheist. But it's the truth. It's like we see it all the time, and I'm going to get to the point that I'm making because we've got the people who are, and when you read Scripture, and I think I've said this other times before, Scripture isn't written to like the atheists. If you realize it, it's written to people who believe in God, and the people who believe in God are crazy. It's like you see God, like a good example. If you were Israelite and you seen God do the 10 plagues to Egypt, and then God saying, hey, I'm going to take you out of the land of Egypt, I'm going to bring you to Canaan, and then it's like you see what God has physically done, and then you groaning and complaining, and it's like, I'd rather be back in Egypt. It's like, what are you talking about? And it's like, it's so easy to look at them and be like, yo, you're bugging, but we do the same thing. Like, we just as hypocritical, and it's like, Scripture isn't geared to the atheist. And I said this one time in one of the earlier chapters. I say, it wasn't, the heathens, it wasn't the pagans who killed Jesus. Who was it? It was the Pharisees. The religious people who killed Jesus. And it's like the Bible is kind of it doesn't necessarily acknowledge the atheists. Actually, I think there's a couple verses, I can think of the verse in Romans, but a lot of times, especially in the New Testament, the letters are to the church. And their messed up behavior.
That's right.
That's who it's talking to, because a lot of times us who claim some sort of piety, we think we so good.